What if I told you that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one loudly demanding attention, but the quiet one sitting in the corner who's finally been pushed too far? Stay with me, because what Carl Jung uncovered about human psychology could completely transform how you see empaths forever. Carl Jung believed that every person carries within them both light and shadow. And nowhere is that duality more visible than in the empath, someone who's often misunderstood. A lot of people confuse empathy with weakness, assuming that if someone feels deeply, they must be fragile. But Jung's research painted a picture that was far more complex, and honestly, a little unsettling. Here's the part most people miss about empaths, and by the end of this, you'll never look at one the same way again. According to Jung, the human psyche isn't just a single layer. It's made up of many different parts operating all at once. There's the persona, which is like a mask we wear in public to fit in or be accepted. It's what we show the world. But what happens when someone with a profound depth of emotional intelligence finally sets that mask aside? Jung's insights into the shadow self, the hidden part of who we are, might surprise you. Empaths, more than almost anyone else, live in what Jung described as the tension of opposites. They feel everything with a rare intensity, but they've learned to hold that intensity inside. They can spot deception easily, yet they keep choosing to believe in people's potential for goodness. That's not naivete. It's what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold two opposing truths at the same time without falling apart. But here's where things take a turn, and why narcissists often underestimate empaths at their own peril. Jung said that the most psychologically integrated individuals are those who have faced their shadow and come out whole on the other side. For empaths, betrayal and manipulation don't just happen occasionally, they're almost a rite of passage. And because of that, empaths are pushed into this process of integration far sooner and more forcefully than most people ever experience. They don't just understand light. They have an intimate familiarity with darkness because life has forced them to stand in it. Narcissists tend to look at empaths and see nothing but softness, compassion they assume can be controlled. That's their fatal miscalculation. Because Jung discovered that people who lead with their hearts often develop the strongest psychological foundations. Why? Because they've been forced to build those foundations just to survive. Pay close attention to what happens next, because this is where the story flips completely. Jung's theory of individuation teaches that every person eventually has to confront their authentic self. For most people, this happens slowly, sometimes so gradually that it never fully completes. But for empaths, especially those who have been betrayed again and again, this process accelerates like a wildfire. The pain they endure becomes the fuel for something Jung described as a psychological rebirth. There's something crucial Jung understood that so many people overlook: emotional sensitivity is not a defect or a liability. It's actually advanced pattern recognition. Empaths don't simply feel emotions in the moment. They take in everything, every manipulation, every lie, every moment of emotional harm, and they store it away. Not as bitterness, but as data. And when all that data builds up to a critical mass, you get to witness what Jung called the emergence of the self. It's a moment that is unstoppable. Jung found that the most profound transformations don't happen when we're comfortable. They happen in crisis. He named this principle enantiodromia, the idea that when something is pushed to its extreme, it flips into its opposite. The empath who's always been patient suddenly becomes immovable. The person who was endlessly giving learns to be selective. The one who kept forgiving decides it's time to be done. This doesn't mean they turn cruel or unfeeling. On the contrary, Jung showed that true strength appears when someone integrates their shadow. When they finally recognize their own capacity to draw boundaries, to say no, to walk away. The empath doesn't lose their heart in this transformation, they finally discover their backbone. And here's the part that will absolutely change the way you think about all of this. According to Jung, there's a huge difference between reacting unconsciously and responding deliberately. Most people are driven by old wounds. They lash out, they retaliate, they try to hurt back. But the empath who's been through the fire and come out the other side, that person learns to operate from conscious choice. They don't need to destroy their betrayer or prove themselves right, because they've already won the battle that matters most, the one within themselves. Jung believed that the greatest victory isn't conquering someone else, it's overcoming the parts of yourself that would pull you down to their level. And this is the precise moment when the narcissist realizes they've made an enormous mistake. Carl Jung observed that manipulators depend on predictable reactions. They count on you to plead, to argue, to keep fighting for a relationship that drains you. But when an empath reaches what Jung called psychological autonomy, they become immune to those tactics. They stop playing the game entirely. Jung discovered that the most powerful position in any relationship dynamic isn't withdrawing out of fear, it's stepping back with clear understanding. The awakened empath doesn't retreat because they're wounded. They pull away because they finally see the truth without any illusions. What happens after that will redefine everything you thought you knew about power. According to Jung's research on psychological types, empaths have something he called feeling function dominance. And this isn't emotional instability, it's an advanced form of emotional intelligence. They can read between the lines. They can pick up on hidden motives. They sense when something feels off before it ever becomes obvious. But there's a twist. Jung noticed that when this emotional intelligence is refined through painful experience, it evolves into something entirely different. The empath stops operating from hurt and starts operating from power. This transformation is nothing short of extraordinary. Jung had a specific name for this, the transcendent function. It's the ability to hold tension without being torn apart, to see the truth without growing bitter, to choose a thoughtful response instead of a knee-jerk reaction. The empath who has been forged in betrayal develops this transcendent function to a level most people will never experience. They become what Jung called individuated, whole, complete in themselves. They no longer look for external validation to confirm their worth. They don't need anyone's permission to trust their own perceptions. They stop depending on people who can't appreciate their depth. But here's the part that will send chills down your spine. According to Carl Jung, there's something called psychological mirroring. Empaths, by nature, reflect back what others project onto them. If someone offers love, the empath shines it right back. If someone projects insecurity, the empath often absorbs it, trying to heal it. But when an empath has been betrayed over and over, something profound changes. They stop reflecting other people's illusions and start revealing them instead. They can see through the charm, the carefully rehearsed excuses, the polished apologies that mean nothing. They watch these patterns play out with perfect clarity. And instead of taking on that dysfunction as their own burden, they begin to reflect it back, not with malice, but with unflinching honesty. And this, Jung discovered, is the most devastating weapon against any form of deception. Because truth, when calmly reflected, cuts deeper than any accusation ever could. The next stage is something Jung called the return of the repressed. And it doesn't just change the empath, it changes everything around them. He understood that when you suppress your authentic power for too long, eventually it doesn't explode in chaos the way most people fear. Instead, it rises in perfect clarity. The empath who has been endlessly understanding, patient, and accommodating eventually becomes immovable. They don't get tangled up in arguments anymore. They don't waste time explaining their boundaries to people who never respected them. They don't try to mend what was never meant to last. They simply remove themselves. Not out of spite, but out of a deep recognition that their well-being is non-negotiable. Jung called this individuation in action, the moment when someone stops fragmenting themselves to please others and starts living from a place of inner wholeness. And here's where it gets fascinating. In the shadow, the part of the psyche most people are afraid to look at, there isn't just darkness. For empaths, the shadow often hides their untapped potential, their capacity for firm boundaries, their right to say no, their power to walk away when something is harmful. Betrayal forces them to integrate this shadow, to reclaim the parts of themselves they were taught to suppress in the name of kindness. Jung discovered that when this happens, it doesn't turn someone cold. It makes them more discerning. They don't stop caring. They simply become intentional about where their care goes. They recognize that their empathy is precious, not something to be handed out to just anyone who demands it. What emerges from this process is what Jung called the individuated self. And it is absolutely unstoppable. He believed that the most dangerous individuals were never the ones who acted out of unprocessed wounds. The real power belongs to those who have transformed their pain into wisdom. The awakened empath is the perfect embodiment of that. They've been to the deepest places of human cruelty, and they didn't stay broken. They came back refined. They understand manipulation because they've survived it firsthand. They can spot gaslighting because they've lived through it and walked away. They recognize emotional vampires because they've been drained by them until they learn to set limits. This isn't paranoia. Jung called it hard-earned discernment. And it's one of the most valuable traits any human being can develop. Because here's the moment where everything changes forever. Jung's theory of psychological development says there comes a point when a person stops looking outside themselves for completion. They stop chasing people to validate them, to heal their old wounds, to make them feel worthy. For the empath who has been betrayed and has chosen to grow instead of collapse, this moment is like a quiet revolution. They stop convincing others of their value. They stop justifying their boundaries. They stop apologizing for their needs. They reach what Jung called psychological sovereignty, complete ownership of their emotional life. But the final transformation, this is the part that feels almost transcendent. Jung named it the return to the self. It's the moment when someone realizes that their sensitivity was never the problem. It was simply waiting to be refined by experience. The fully awakened empath embodies this paradox in the most remarkable way. They still feel everything. But now, they choose carefully what they respond to. They still understand deeply, but they don't engage blindly. They forgive, but they no longer forget. Jung taught that the most integrated people are those who can hold both their light and their shadow in conscious awareness. And that's exactly what the transformed empath learns to do. They've mastered what he called appropriate response, the wisdom to know when to be gentle and when to be firm. When to offer compassion and when to offer a clear, unwavering no. And here's the final piece that makes them nearly untouchable. According to Jung, the highest form of psychological development happens when a person no longer needs anyone else to complete them. The awakened empath doesn't reach this state by shutting everyone out. They arrive there through integration, by accepting every part of who they are, even the parts they once felt ashamed of. They become whole not by isolating themselves, but by choosing where they belong with great care. They no longer try to rescue people who don't want to be saved. They don't pursue those who run at the first sign of accountability. They don't keep pouring their love into black holes disguised as relationships. They've learned what Jung called the art of conscious relationship, only engaging where there is mutual respect, genuine care, and reciprocity. And the result of this? Jung had a name for it, the individuated empath. A person who's not just strong but profoundly wise. Someone who has turned every betrayal into the raw material for their own transformation. He described these individuals as a force of nature. Not destructive, but unstoppable. Not aggressive, but unshakably certain of who they are. The awakened empath doesn't need revenge. They've outgrown the desire for it. They don't need to prove their worth. They know it intimately. They don't fear being alone. Because they've learned to be the best possible companion to themselves. This is what Jung meant by becoming psychologically complete. The empath who has transformed their deepest wounds into their greatest strengths is no longer someone you can manipulate or control. And that, according to everything Jung discovered, is the most terrifying realization a narcissist can ever have. The person they once underestimated is the person they can never touch again. And that's what makes the empath's journey from victim to sovereign so powerful. It isn't just a personal transformation, it's what Jung described as the hero's journey of the psyche. They descend into darkness, confront the parts of themselves they were taught to deny, and face the shadows that once held them captive. But instead of losing themselves, they integrate those experiences. They don't come back weaker. They return with a level of self-knowledge and inner authority most people never find. Carl Jung believed that suffering, when it's faced directly and consciously processed, becomes the raw material for wisdom. And this is why the empath who has walked through betrayal and heartbreak doesn't just survive. They emerge as the light that can guide others out of their own darkness. They become living proof of Jung's most profound insight, that within every wound, there is a hidden seed of transcendence waiting to be discovered. This is the psychology of the awakened empath. It's why their presence feels so different, why their quiet certainty can disarm even the most manipulative person in the room. They're no longer fueled by the need to be accepted or loved by everyone. They've learned that their worth was never up for debate. They've turned their pain into clarity, their heartbreak into discernment, and their former powerlessness into something unshakable. The empath who has truly awakened no longer tries to convince anyone of their value. They don't explain why their boundaries exist or why their needs matter. They simply embody it. And in that embodiment, they create a field around them where only the genuine can thrive. Because they no longer tolerate what drains them, and they don't feel guilty for it anymore. Jung often spoke about the return to the self as the most important moment in a person's life. He said that when you reach that point, when you stop outsourcing your wholeness and finally stand complete within yourself, you experience a kind of liberation that changes everything. It's not the liberation of escaping pain or avoiding discomfort. It's the freedom of realizing you can face anything and remain intact. That's why the fully individuated empath isn't just compassionate, they are discerning. They don't stop feeling deeply. But they no longer hand that depth over to people who haven't earned it. They don't stop caring. But they no longer betray themselves to keep someone else comfortable. They don't stop forgiving. But they finally understand that forgiveness doesn't require them to stay connected to those who refuse to change. This is the paradox of the awakened empath. They become soft and strong all at once. They can love with their whole heart, but also walk away without hesitation when respect is absent. They can be present for other people's pain, but never again at the expense of their own well-being. They can see the best in people, while never ignoring the reality of who they are. And in this state of psychological sovereignty, they embody what Jung called the most advanced stage of human development, the integration of the shadow and the light. The ability to stand in the fullness of who you are, without shame, without apology, and without needing permission. Jung believed that this kind of self-possession is what makes a person truly powerful. Not the ability to control others, but the capacity to no longer be controlled by your own unhealed wounds. The empath who's reached this point has nothing left to prove, nothing left to chase, nothing left to beg for. They've become a force of nature, steady, clear, and impossible to manipulate. So, the next time you encounter someone who seems soft-spoken, who feels everything, who quietly steps back instead of arguing, remember this: you may be witnessing the most powerful transformation there is. You may be standing in the presence of someone who has done the work to integrate their shadow, reclaim their strength, and embody their worth. They won't try to convince you of anything. They won't need to. Because the awakened empath has already learned the deepest truth of all, that you don't have to prove your value to anyone who is committed to misunderstanding you. You only have to honor it within yourself. Carl Jung said that when someone has walked into the darkness and chosen to face what they find there, they become unrecognizable to those who once tried to break them. They no longer play the old roles. They no longer respond to old provocations. They don't shrink to make others comfortable, and they don't betray themselves to belong. This is what true power looks like. Quiet, unassuming, rooted in self-respect. The kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice to be felt. The kind that doesn't have to prove anything to be real. The empath who has reached this place is dangerous not because they are out to hurt anyone, but because they can never again be coerced, guilt, or manipulated into abandoning themselves. So, if you've ever been the empath in the room, the one who felt too much, gave too much, forgave too much, know this: your sensitivity is not your weakness. It's your superpower. And when you combine it with discernment and self-respect, it becomes a force that no narcissist, manipulator, or abuser can withstand. This is the psychology of the individuated empath. It's what happens when someone turns their suffering into wisdom, their heartbreak into strength, and their pain into a profound commitment to their own well-being. It's what Jung called the hero's journey, the transformation from wounded to whole. If you've walked through your own darkness and come back wiser, you already know this truth: you don't need anyone's permission to stand fully in who you are. You don't have to shrink to be loved or betray yourself to feel worthy. You are enough, exactly as you are, and you always have been. Thank you so much for staying with me through this exploration. If you found value in today's discussion, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. You never know whose life you might touch just by passing this message along.